Hello, I'd like to welcome you to the second of our presentations on budget lines and price changes related to marginal utility theory. As the first one, this satisfies the requirements of the A-level course from the UK, but also of the advanced placement stream from the US. Learning outcomes are set out here with corresponding references to slides. So we're going to be looking at budget lines, which is a development from the first lesson, and looking at different combinations or bundles of goods and services that consumers can enjoy. We're also going to look at the impact of a price change, and we call these the income and substitution effects of a price change and how they can affect budget lines. We're also going to look at what we call indifference curves, and I have not seen that, to be honest, mentioned in the AP course, though I have seen it mentioned in the A2 syllabus from the UK. So if you are doing advanced placement, you may want to leave those two slides out. Okay, we're going to be referencing a consumer called Sylvia, and we're going to start now on the budget lines and some basics. We're going to assume that Sylvia has an income of $4,000 per month. Okay, and she's happy to spend all of that on two particular goods, clothing or accommodation. You can assume that food is provided by family or whatever else you want to assume. We always make these simplifying assumptions in economics so that we can focus our attention on specific changes. Okay, we need to make two more assumptions, and that is about the price of each good. We're going to assume that accommodation is $1,000 per unit per month, and clothing prices are $100 per item. So we're looking at three different variables, okay? Income, Sylvia's income, the price of good 1, which we can assume is clothing, and the price of good 2, which we can assume is accommodation. Three variables, that's all we need for budget analysis. I've drawn the budget line for Sylvia based upon the data that we have given. So her income is $4,000 and accommodation is $1,000. So she can afford 4 units per month. Hence we have an intercept here for the budget line on the accommodation unit axis of 4. Okay, 4,000 divided by 1,000 gives you 4 units. If she spent all her income on accommodation and nothing on clothing, then she could have 4 accommodation units. Of course, that's not going to be suitable for her, but we want to check out the maximum kind of bundle of goods that she can afford to buy, and then we can look later at where she would like to be. In other words, what bundle she would like to consume. As for clothing, well, clothing items are $100 per item, so how many can she afford? Well, the answer is 4,000 divided by 100, which will give you the 40 that we have on the intercept over here. So we have a budget line, okay, and the two intercepts are 4 for accommodation and 40 for clothing. Now, of course, in reality, she's probably going to be consuming at one of these points that I'm identifying on the budget line. Okay, if she wanted to save, where would she be? I'll give you a few seconds to work that one out. If she wanted to save some money, where would she be? Okay, I hope you got that. She's going to be somewhere inside here. Okay, but if she wanted to spend more than that, she's going to have to either use some saving or borrow, and then she could, in theory, consume somewhere like a point such as that. Okay, we're going to assume that she doesn't borrow, she doesn't use saving, nor does she save her money by not spending. She spends all of her income, so she's somewhere on the budget line. Notice that the budget line does not tell us what she would like to consume, it only tells us what she can consume. Okay, that's a very important point. That's the first slide finished with. We're now going to move on to the next slide and look at the impact of various changes in those three variables upon the budget line. Remember, we said there are three possible situations that can happen here. We've got three variables. So income can change, the price of good 1 can change, and the price of good 2 can change. And examiners will often ask you multiple choice questions, giving you a shift in a budget line and asking you what kind of configuration of changes might have caused that. Okay, this particular example, the first one, we have a parallel shift in the budget line. Okay, I'm going to make that very clear by drawing the lines that indicate these two budget lines are parallel, and the curve has shifted out. So now the intercepts have changed, 4 to 6 here and 40 to 60 here. So there's a proportionate shift, of course, in the amount of accommodation and clothing items that Sylvia can buy. She's very happy. She's had a pay rise. Her income is now $6,000 per month. The gradient, of course, of the budget line is exactly the same, and the gradient is given by PY over PX. In other words, the price of accommodation divided by the price of clothing, which will be basically a ratio of 1 to 10. In other words, if she wanted to consume, let's say 10 more clothing items, she'd have to give up 1 unit of accommodation. The ratio is 1 to 10. PY divided by PX is a ratio of 1 to 10. Right. We can see here that this shift has been caused by an increase in income. In theory, it could also have been caused had income not changed at all. Okay. How else could that have been caused? How else could we have had a shift out in the budget line of the nature specified here? I'm going to wait about 10 seconds, as I would do in a real classroom, for you to answer. Okay, then I'm going to call out the answer. How else could that budget line have shifted out here without there being an increase in income? Assume income stayed the same. Okay, I hope you got that. It could have been caused by a fall in price of accommodation and clothing of the same proportion. So incomes could have stayed the same, but the two intercepts could have changed by a proportionate fall in the price of accommodation and the price of clothing of the same degree. And in that case, the budget line again would have shifted out in the same way. So these questions are often answered well by students who can think about different possibilities. If we hold income constant, what price change could have caused that shift? If we hold one of the prices constant, what else could have caused that? And then you're going to be down to income, for example. Okay, we've got another example coming up here now. Here we have what seems to be a strange change here. We've got a pivoting action. Okay, there's the first curve. Okay, 6 and 60, and then the curve shifts in, but not in a parallel fashion. Rather, it pivots around the intercept on the accommodation unit axis. What assumptions have I made here? I've assumed that income stays the same at $6,000 per month, but the price of clothing now has risen, okay, to $133 per item. So $6,000 per month divided by 133 will give us 45 clothing items. So she can now afford to buy less clothing items per month than when, of course, the price was higher. And that has actually altered the gradient of the budget line. Remember, the gradient is what? Is what we call the relative price ratio, which is PY divided by PX. And now the price of clothing, which is our PX, has increased. So therefore the relative price has changed. And effectively accommodation has now become relatively cheaper. Okay, or we can say that clothing has become relatively more expensive. Okay, where is Sylvia going to consume? Let's say that she had consumed initially at a point such as A on the first budget line. Where will she consume now? It could be that she consumes at B. It could be that she consumes at C, and it could be that she consumes at D. Okay, and we have, of course, a range of different possibilities here. If she goes from A to B, she's consuming less accommodation and less clothing. If she goes from A to C, then she's effectively consuming less clothing but the same amount of accommodation. But if she goes from A to D here, then she's consuming more clothing and less accommodation. Okay, now how can it be that the price of clothing has risen and she ends up consuming more clothing? Well, that's a special case, and we are going to come back to that in a few slides, God willing. Okay, now we've got a quick question for you here for you to work out. So we have there a budget line MN, and we have another budget line coming up here, which is okay, there should be a P there. Let me put the P in. So we have one budget line PS and another budget line MN, and notice here that they intersect somewhere in the middle. Okay, the budget line moves from MN to PS. So MN is the initial one and PS is the new one. Okay, assume that the price of accommodation did not change. The price of accommodation, which we've taken to be the price of good 2, did not change. So let's put an X here. Okay, there's no way that price can change. We've been told that. We've been given an assumption. Now, what are the possible explanations as to why the budget line has shifted from MN to PS, but we're not allowed to change the price of accommodation? There are two variables left. So we would assume there must be a change in either one or both of either income or the price of good 1, the price of clothing. So now we have to work out what can have happened to income and the price of good 1, clothing, in order for the budget line to have shifted from MN to PS. Where do we start? Well, I would start, if I were you, with the information that has been given. Start with what you know and move to what you do not know. Okay, that's a basic rule that I like to apply in answering multiple choice questions. Start with what you know and move, even if you're not sure where you're going, closer to where you need to be to answer the question. Well, we've been told that the price of accommodation did not change. Okay, the price of accommodation did not change, but somehow, somehow we can now afford more accommodation. How can it be that the price of accommodation has not changed, but we can afford more accommodation? Okay, if we were to spend all our money on it. It can't be because of a change in the price of good 1. Okay, because that would not affect the intercept on the accommodation axis. So it must have been down to the other variable, in other words, income. We can now afford more accommodation, but the price of accommodation has not changed. That proves beyond all doubt that income has risen. So we can say for sure here that income has risen. Okay, so now we know two things. The price of accommodation didn't change, but income has risen. What about the price of good 1? Let's go to the good 1 axis over here. Okay, MN to PS. We can now afford, what's the answer, more clothing or less clothing? We can now afford more clothing or less clothing. We've gone from MN to PS. We can now afford less clothing. Okay, but income has gone up. Income has gone up, and we can afford less clothing. So what does that prove? That proves that the price of good 1, in other words clothing, has risen by more than income. So we can say here there's been a relatively significant rise in the price of good 1, clothing, which has offset the rise in income, meaning that if we were to have spent all of our income on clothing, we could have actually bought less than before. Okay, so that's a summary of what we have learned from this swiveling of the budget lines around a point of intersection somewhere in the middle there. Let's see if we got the answer right. Step by step, what do we know so far? Start with what you know. The price of accommodation, no change. Sylvia can buy more accommodation because P is greater than M. She can afford less clothing. S is less than N. So from 1 and 2 above, from these 2 points, from 1 and 2 above, okay, income must have risen. Then transfer that knowledge to number 3. Okay, as income rose, but she can buy less clothes from number 3 here, it must also be that the price of clothes has risen as well. So thank God we got the answer right, and I hope that you guys are beginning to get the picture and see how to work out these situations. Okay, we're now moving on to a related but slightly different topic, and that is looking at price changes. Okay, looking at price changes. In the first of our 2 presentations, we looked at, for example, meat and beans, and I'm, pretty much coming back to the same example there. Imagine a poor family. They consume beans and meat. Okay, they're a poor family, so relatively low income. Picture them. A poor family, relatively low income. They consume beans and meat. Now assume that the price of beans falls. In economics, we actually break down the impact of this price change into 2 different parts. And for most of you, this might be a very new concept. So far, you might have been used only to looking at prices falling, and therefore there's going to be some kind of extension of demand. Now we're going to delve in more detail on what actually happens when you have a price change. Context, poor family, consuming beans and meat. Okay, the price of beans falls. What will happen then is that this poor consumer will switch to some extent away from meat to beans. That is called the substitution effect. And we always assume that the substitution effect is negative. In other words, as prices rise, consumers switch away from the product and consume less. When prices fall, consumers switch into it and consume more. So the substitution effect is 100% of the time going to be negative. How negative will depend upon our old friend, the price elasticity of demand, and so on. That we're going to leave for now. There's another impact that is new here for you. Imagine that poor family. Let's say they used to spend, for example, $10 a week on beans, and now the price of beans has fallen. Without considering the substitution effect and the increased consumption of beans, let's say that now the $10 that they were spending per week before, okay, now becomes, for example, $7. They now spend $7 a week. That means that they have $3 extra per week to spend on something. Okay, they were spending $10 per week on beans. Now the price of beans has gone down, so they are left with a kind of, consumer surplus, if you like, temporarily to call it that, of $3 per week. And the question now that we ask in economics is, what are they going to do with the extra $3 per week? In reality, in effect, they have more income. Okay, they could either buy now more beans to the tune of $3, more meat to the tune of $3, 1.5 on each, or some other configuration. And there are different possibilities here. Here we're looking at what we call the income effect. And I hope that you remember the concept, the more basic concept of the income elasticity of demand. If you have forgotten that, you need to kind of revise that here. This is the percentage change in demand, okay, divided by the percentage change in income. And this is always positive for normal goods Okay, positive for normal goods, and it's always negative for inferior goods. Okay, it's negative for inferior goods. Sorry for the bad typing there. So now the price of beans has gone down. This family has more income. If it's a normal good, okay, if it's a normal good, they will actually buy more beans because they have more income. So in that case, the substitution effect and the income effect move together. Lower prices for beans, more consumption from the substitution effect, but also more consumption from the income effect. So they move together. However, if beans are an inferior product, then the income elasticity of demand is negative, and the extra income will be spent on meat, not on what? Not on beans. And therefore, effectively what's going to happen is that the income effect goes against the substitution effect. The income effect goes against the substitution effect. So you have two opposing effects now, okay? And it may be that the substitution effect dominates, so that overall consumers buy more beans. But it could also be that the income effect dominates, and that would lead to the demand for beans actually falling overall, even though the price fell. So now you're learning that prices may fall and actually cause demand to fall, and that happens when products are strongly inferior, okay, where the income effect of an inferior product dominates the substitution effect. Okay, and we're coming back to that, I think, in the last slide. But put that in your mind now. The price of beans falls, and it's possible that demand will fall overall, where the income effect dominates the substitution effect, and the product is inferior. Okay. Well, here we have a couple of pictures to whet your appetite. A nice plate of baked beans there, and a plate of lamb chops, 3 lamb chops, and some broccoli. Okay. Ooh, making me hungry. Let's have a look at the impact now of the income and substitution effect on budget lines. And we're going to assume that we start with a budget line of LM. Okay, LM. But that the price of beans falls as in the previous slide. Okay, so that it pivots around the intercept on the meat axis, and effectively if all income were to be spent on beans, then more beans could be purchased, but the same amount of meat as before. We start off at a point such as A. So this consumer is consuming a relatively kind of balanced diet. They're having some meat, yes, and they're also having some beans. Okay, so we're going to check them both or tick them both. This consumer, poor family, is consuming a mixture of meat and beans. But now the price of beans goes down, so we move now onto a new budget line, LN. Okay, LN. And I've assumed that the consumption bundle moves from A up to B. From A up to B. Okay, now what can have caused that to happen? Okay, let's clear the marks there. What can have caused that to happen? Well, the substitution effect is always negative. So the price of beans fell, it must have led to an increase in the consumption of beans. So we must have moved somehow this way because of the substitution effect. There must be more consumption of beans whenever the price of beans falls according to the substitution effect. But of course we've moved away from point B now, and that's where we have to look at the income effect. This consumer now has extra income left. As beans are cheaper, they effectively have a rise in their income. So what may happen now, if beans are strongly inferior, the extra income and even some of the other income as well must have been spent on meat, and overall there'll actually be less income spent on beans. Okay, so what's happened now is that substitution effect, let's put an S there, has been dominated completely by a very strong income effect which has forced the consumption back from that point over to a point such as this in terms of bean consumption, and the extra income saved, okay, from the $3 and even more from the initial amount of income spent, has gone into much higher consumption of meat, which of course is a normal and more specifically luxury good, and those lamb chops do look very delicious, and I can assure you they were. Okay, let's just recap there. We start off at A. The substitution effect will lead this poor family to consuming more beans, but now effectively they have more income, and the higher income now causes them overall to spend a lot less on beans, okay, and to increase their consumption considerably of meat, leading to a new position at B. And what's happened here is that for this poor family, we call this revealed preference. In other words, the poor family has revealed their preference. Okay, we haven't really analyzed marginal utility, but what's happened is that they have revealed their preference in moving from a consumption bundle at A with a mixed amount of meat and beans to a new consumption bundle at B, with much higher consumption of meat and much lower consumption of beans. So the price of beans has fallen and consumption has fallen. Okay, effectively the demand curve is upward sloping, not downward sloping. Lower price of beans, less consumption of beans. Okay, so if we were to draw a demand curve mapped in the usual way with P and Q over here, okay, the demand curve for a Giffen good, these are called Giffen goods, strongly inferior goods, would actually be upward sloping, where you have a fall in the price and you actually have lower consumption as shown there. Okay, moving on now to almost the last slide. The last two slides in fact are multiple choice questions for yourselves to answer, and it'll be self-correcting there, and I put a few comments in case you get the answers wrong. So we're going to look now very briefly at indifference curves. As far as I can see from the AP syllabus, they're not included, but if anyone does find to the contrary, then please write an email to me at yusuf.ashworth@hotmail.com, and I think my address is on the last slide. Just in case, I can write it here for you. So yusuf.ashworth, that's ASHWORTH @hotmail.com. Okay, if you have any knowledge about the AP syllabus that I don't have, then please do write to me, but as far as I can see, it's not included in the AP syllabus, but is mentioned specifically in the A-level syllabus for UK stream. Okay, so if you're following AP, you can skip the next two slides and move on to the multiple choice questions in slides 11 and 12. Right, what are these indifference curves all about? Well, let's start with the English meaning of the word indifference. The word indifferent, take the adjective, not the noun, means that we are kind of, neutral between two different things. So if I present two vacation options to you, to travel, for example, to India or to travel to Colombia, and you are indifferent between them, that means that you don't really mind which one is provided for you. You are neutral. In common English, you don't really care which one is selected for you. Okay, so this is what indifference curves mean here. It's a curve that shows the total utility that can be got from consuming different products. And for convenience, I've kept the same two products here, meat and beans. So let's start with the basic one here. This is the lowest level of utility because it involves limited amounts of meat and limited amounts of beans. And as we move on to higher total utility curves further out from the origin, okay, that means that we are enjoying higher consumption bundles and higher standards of living. So higher utility is enjoyed the further out we are. So if you go from total utility 1 up to total utility 2 and then 3, you are enjoying higher and higher living standards. Okay, and that's what happens in most countries over time with, of course, economic growth. Right, let's clear the markings now, and let's just take one particular indifference curve. So now you've understood that moving out from the origin onto different utility curves means a higher standard of living. But what about moving from one point on a curve to another point on the same curve? In other words, moving from M for mother to N for naughty to P for particular or place. Well, let's say at M, okay, we are consuming 0A meat and 0D beans. Okay, our plate has loads of meat, loads of lamb chops, all 3 lamb chops in fact, but only a few beans. Okay, now some guy comes along, maybe a naughty member of your family, and takes away one of your lamb chops. They take away AB of your lamb chops, so you now have 2 lamb chops. You're very upset, but you say to them, look, I don't mind you taking my lamb chop as long as you give me, okay, some of your beans. And how many beans do I have to get to make me just as happy as I was before? I need precisely DE, and I'm going to end up at N for naughty. I am on the same indifference curve with the same total utility. That means that I am just as well off as I was before. I have been adequately compensated by my naughty family member. Okay. Now, the guy who took my first lamb chop enjoyed it so much he thinks to himself, or she thinks to herself, it's time to get another one. So when I'm not looking, another lamb chop suddenly disappears from my plate. And this time I'm really kind of getting a bit miffed here. You know, I'm losing meat big time. So I say to my my sibling, okay, you've taken another lamb chop. I know it's you. It has to be you. There's no one else that can have done it. I now need compensation. Okay. I was at N. Okay, now I'm going to move down to P. So I've lost BC of meat. I now need to have EF of beans to compensate me, and then I move to a new point, P, to make myself just as happy as I was before. I am now on the same indifference curve. Now notice that initially for the first lamb chop lost I needed only DE of compensation. Now because the curve is convex to the origin, I actually need EF compensation of beans. Why do I need a lot more beans now to compensate me for the loss of just one lamb chop as it was before? The answer lies in the old friend that we learnt about in the first presentation, and that is diminishing marginal utility. You know, I've only got one lamb chop now, and there's a limit to how much beans can compensate me for the loss of another lamb chop. So I need a lot more beans to provide adequate compensation, because as I eat more and more beans, I experience diminishing marginal utility, and I need more and more to compensate me for the loss of my my second lamb chop. Okay, you guys might be the same as me, right? Okay, let's move on now to the very last slide, again slightly higher level, so be prepared. I'm sure you guys can cope with it. This is probably the most exciting part, to be honest. Here we have 2 budget lines. They illustrate what I can afford to buy based on 3 variables, right? What are they? My income and the prices of both goods. Now, the relative prices of meat and beans are given as before by the formula Py over Px. And here again, I've made these lines parallel, okay? Because I want to make sure that I'm holding income constant, and we have a change in prices, or I'm going to change income and the prices stay the same. Here I'm assuming that the B1 and B2 have the same prices as before, okay, so therefore I've increased income. Okay, so now we have a higher income level in moving from A to B. Indifference curves illustrate what I want to buy. Budget lines illustrate what I can afford. Given the choice, of course, I would prefer to have B than A, because I have higher total utility. Okay, I've got higher total utility. Now, do you remember the equimarginal principle from the first slide, the first lesson? the marginal utility of beans divided by the price of beans equals the marginal utility of meat divided by the price of meat. That is a condition for consumers to maximize total utility. So if consumers want to maximize total utility, we taught you that they have to satisfy the equimarginal principle, where the MU of beans divided by the price of beans, in fact the marginal utility per dollar spent on beans, must equal the marginal utility per dollar spent on meat, and so on for all other goods, and also for the value of holding money. Okay? Now if you take that formula, right, take that formula and just make a small adjustment. So we take this variable here onto that side of the equation, and this variable here onto this side of the equation. Okay, that's going to basically come up like that. What do we end up with? We end up with the marginal utility of beans divided by the marginal utility of meat, okay, will equal the price of beans divided by the price of meat. Okay, all I've done there is readjust the equimarginal principle, but that actually is an amazing equation, because what that tells us is that the relative price construct here, the relative price variable here now, the price of beans divided by the price of meat, that is actually the gradient of the budget line. That is a gradient of the budget line, and the marginal utility of beans over marginal utility of meat is actually the gradient of an indifference curve. Okay, it's a gradient of an indifference curve. We lose some meat, how much beans do I have to be compensated for to satisfy my taste buds and be indifferent between the two? So what this equation now says is that for consumers to maximize total utility, they do so at a point where the budget line, okay, is tangent to, equals the gradient of the indifference curve. That is the point where the consumer will maximize utility, and it means effectively that consumers maximize utility subject to a budget constraint. I mean, I can draw another indifference curve here, for example, TU3, but TU3 is not possible for the consumer to actually reach, so therefore it's outside his or her possibility range at the moment. Therefore they can't maximize their utility at that point. So what consumers do is they maximize utility where the indifference curve touches at one point the highest budget line they can get to, and that of course is where we are at B here, and we have maximized our utility in that way. Okay, that really completes all that we're going to tackle on utility. I hope that you've enjoyed the two presentations. I do advise you to watch them a few times perhaps, and also do a bit more research on the internet, read your textbooks, and do practice past paper questions, whether for the AP course or for the A-level course. I've got two multiple choice questions following on now after this, which you can attempt yourselves, and answers will be given with my own comments to help you understand why the right answers are right and the wrong answers are wrong. Great to have been with you. Goodbye. Thank you.